My brother ruined my life, got my wife pregnant, and it turned out our son wasn't mine. Now, after being disowned by our parents, he's trying to come back, and I was left with their $3 million inheritance. I have a little brother named Noah who has hated me for as long as I can remember. If you're thinking it's probably because he's jealous, you're wrong. No, it was always Noah, the favorite in our family, not me. Let me tell you how. My mom always coddled him like he was the golden child. She cooked his meals, did his laundry, and even had me help him with his schoolwork. Because he's family, I was supposed to help out, but I never got the same in return. I eventually accepted this dynamic, partly because I was independent and did not want to be a burden to anyone. Maybe it is my fault, for I always catered to his needs without expecting anything in return. Noah only reached out when he needed something and never offered to help me when I did. Growing up, I was the quiet, introverted kid who liked studying and keeping to myself. Noah, on the other hand, was loud and boisterous, just like our dad. I've always been straight to the point, honest and blunt. I say things as they are, without sugarcoating them. I think my mom may have developed some negative views towards me because of my personality. It only made Noah an even bigger favorite in our family. I did not think much of our differences while growing up, but things really got bad when Noah would make fun of me and bully me for being unlike him. He would tease me about my height or make fun of me for wearing glasses. Worse, he would sneak into my room, read my diary, and then run to my mom to complain about whatever I had written. Anytime I confronted him, or even complained to my parents about his constant invasion of privacy, they would just brush it off, actually finding it funny, as if it were harmless fun. But he started getting worse and worse. He started doing things like almost breaking my glasses or putting disgusting stuff in my food. Once, he even put little stones in my cereal, and fortunately I saw them so that I wouldn't hurt my teeth. When I told my mom about it, she just brushed it off and said, "That's how brothers bond." It happened every time we argued. Noah went straight for my insecurities, berating me with the things he knew would hurt me most. But at school, things were even worse. He knew a couple of kids in my class would sometimes bully me. Far from defending me, he encouraged them. He joined in, calling me names like ugly loser or hairy monkey, and went on to even urge the bullies to do physical harm to me, saying I was nothing better than a failure. One time, he went to another level after some petty argument that I can just barely remember now. His behavior was relentless, and it left me feeling isolated. He once told me to kill myself. While I could usually brush off his other insults, that one hit me hard because I was struggling with my mental health at the time. Although I'm in a better place now, hearing my own brother say he wanted me gone was devastating. With Dad often at work and Mom dismissing my concerns, it felt like no one cared. In fact, Mom once scolded me, saying it was my fault for irritating him. Things only got worse. One time, in high school, Noah actually tried to burn my hair. When I told Mom, I was shocked that she sided with him, insisting he was just playing. Who plays like that? Thankfully, my dad finally stepped in. For the first time, somebody held Noah accountable. Dad not only stood up for me, but also warned Noah that if he didn't clean up his act, he'd call the cops on him. For Noah, this was a wake-up call. He had never really been in trouble for anything. And now, Dad finally said to him, in no uncertain terms, that he needed to start showing respect to his older brother, me. Later that evening, Dad came into my room to talk. It was one of those few times when I really felt heard and supported, and I could feel that things could finally be turning around. I really didn't expect my dad to take my side, especially since he always told Noah how similar they were while he was growing up. And, to be fair, it was true. Dad said he had waited the better part of a decade, silently and patiently, for Noah to grow out of his behavior, which, At first, he assumed was just immaturity, but now it was clear it was a bully he had. I almost cried hearing my dad say that, feeling so validated. I told him everything Noah had done to me over the years. I even opened up about the bullying I had been going through in school. My dad was absolutely shocked at how much I had suffered. The next day, he went to the school and met with the principal to make sure my bullies were warned that they would do some real jail time if this continued. Later that evening, Dad took another step to help me. He enrolled me in MMA classes at a local gym. He said it was time for me to stand up for myself and face bullies head-on. I'll admit, the idea of a quiet, bookish kid like me trying to learn how to fight must have seemed ridiculous. But, as with everything in my life, I was determined to give it my best. When I want to learn a subject, I give it my undivided attention. I was able to take care of school while still finding time to hit the gym every day and train in MMA class. Not to brag, but it changed my life and my body. One day, Noah was up to his old tricks. He had stolen my pocket money, the allowance we earned by helping our parents with chores. I had been saving for quite a while, and Noah had sneaked into my room and taken it. I caught him just as he was about to ride off with his friends on his bike. I confronted him, telling him pointedly to give back the money and that it was wrong to steal, but Noah just grinned at me and said I could do nothing but run to Dad. Something inside of me just snapped. Before I realized it, I had landed a solid punch right on his face. Noah was absolutely stunned when he fell backward onto the ground. I calmly picked him up, took my money back out of his trouser pocket, and then dropped him back to the ground. What followed was almost comical. Noah started crying loudly, almost like a little kid in a tantrum. The sight of a teenage boy crying on the floor is something I won't forget anytime soon. My mother, hearing Noah wailing loudly, ran out of the house to save her baby boy and investigate what was happening. Learning that I had fought with Noah, she was first shocked and then turned to scold me. She said I was older and should be a good example of Noah's age. Noah, on his side, stood smirking at me, clearly enjoying my chastisement. Later, Mom complained to Dad about how I had attacked Noah and demanded I needed to be punished. Dad, however, was calm but firm in asking us to explain what had happened. I told the truth. Noah had taken money that I had worked very hard to save. Noah tried to justify himself by saying he needed it for a date, and that, as his brother, it should be my duty to help him. But Dad didn't have it. He told Noah that he was very lucky that I had only punched him, since in real life, stealing could be taken more drastically. Someone else might have called the police. Then he made it very clear to Noah that in no way was he ever entitled to take people's things without their permission. Noah didn't like being called out and began throwing a tantrum, obviously hoping that our mother would back him up. But Dad held his ground. When Noah finally realized I wasn't going to get in trouble for standing up for myself, his tantrum slowly fizzled out. It was a moment that finally shifted the dynamic between us. He yelled at how much he hated me before he stormed into his room and locked it behind him. After that, Noah kept his distance. It was almost as though he finally realized he couldn't push me around any longer, especially since Dad wasn't backing him up. For the first time in a very long while, it felt like we were actually on level ground. Although Noah himself stopped trying to push me around physically, he would take every opportunity to make a verbal jab at me, mostly when our parents were not in the room. As he grew older, his behavior seemed to degenerate further. Every year that went by saw him angrier and more volatile still, his fuse far shorter. If ever I tried to talk to him, he ignored me totally, and I would see him walk out of the room, muttering something like, "nerd" or "loser." When he needed something from me, he refused to approach me directly and would instead ask our mother to pass along the message. Frustrated, I often asked her why Noah couldn't just talk to me himself. Always, she pleaded with me to try and be more understanding. but it seemed she was just encouraging his behavior. I could never quite deduce if Noah's hostility was an adolescence phase or if he really hated me. All these years, I did manage to put up with him, his words, but it began to reach a point of no return. I actually began yearning to move out, not for independence, but to escape from him. I would go to my mother, asking her if she could help arrange a sit-down conversation between Noah and me so that we could work out our issues, but she would always say no, that she did not want to get involved. When I asked her why Noah treated me the way he did, she would change the subject or say something that dismissed the question itself. I finally left for my dream university. All the hard work and good grades finally paid off in the form of a scholarship. My dad even threw a party about it, telling me how proud Mom was. Noah remained distant as ever. He barely lifted an eyebrow regarding my feats. Leaving home for university was bittersweet. I was excited by the opportunities ahead, but mostly relieved to get out of the toxic environment in which I had grown up. When I finally did settle, the difference was all but palpable. New friends, classes I actually enjoyed, and a life independent from the oppressive atmosphere in which I had wasted far too many years of my life. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living in fear of Noah's verbal attacks, and I knew a peace I had never experienced. In my second year, I met Susan, who would become my future wife. We were introduced by a friend at a fraternity party, and we really clicked with each other. Raised as a religious person, having children before marriage was something I had always known was never an option for me. The minute I met Susan, it was almost like the beginning of another chapter, full of hope and positives, totally away from the negatives of the past. However, in our last year at university, we found out Susan was pregnant. This was unexpected news that fast-tracked us into getting married right after graduation. We had a quiet, peaceful wedding, filled with love and just a handful of close family members present. Both families were pleased with the decision, and we did have a really good time. At this point, I honestly thought that she was the love of my life. I always believed in monogamy, and I thought that I wanted to spend a life with a single person, to have someone to come home to and to share the journey with. Susan was all and more than I ever wanted in a partner. I never gave other women a second glance through the years because I was so happy in my marriage and I couldn't think of doing anything that might hurt Susan. But our marriage, too, was not without some storms that I had never anticipated. There were 2 instances in which I found out that Susan had cheated on me. The first was an on-again, off-again affair with a married coworker that lasted several years. The latter was a brief fling with her ex-boyfriend from high school when she visited her family out of state. In retrospect, I am sure some would brand me naive, even foolish, for how I handled these betrayals. And truthfully, I can't say I completely disagree. After each discovery, we went through periods of separation in which we tried to process the pain and figure out whether our marriage could survive. I decided to forgive my wife because I never wanted to raise my child in a broken home. Deep down, I felt we could get through all of this. We were pretty young when the thing happened with her colleague, and I put it down to immaturity and a lack of good judgment. For some time, things actually looked up between us. Though I could never bring myself to trust her fully again, I managed to push my suspicions deep down. And I knew if I ever made the choice to forgive her, I had to be willing to move forward and start fresh, rebuilding our relationship. It's now been 4 years since her second betrayal, and for most of that time, I felt reassured that I had done the right thing in giving her another chance. Susan seemed to have genuinely changed, and our marriage seemed stronger. We were really happy and had plans laid out for the future of our family. But 3 months ago, my world was shattered all over again. This time, though, in a way I could never have dreamed of. Susan finally confessed to me she'd had another long-term affair. to rub the salt deeper, she dropped the bombshell that our son may not even be mine. Her words hit me like the ground had been pulled from under my feet. A rush of shock, betrayal, and unbelievability hit me, and I strained to work my way through the enormity in what she had just told me. During the next several days, I fought to make sense of it all, and I demanded answers. I asked her why she had kept such a catastrophic secret, and how she could have hurt me this way. Her response was ice cold, almost as if she were detached from the consequences of her actions. All her responses to my questions only forced me further into confusion, leaving me with more questions than answers. It was truly a very surreal and gut-wrenching moment to be confronted not only with the betrayal, but also with uncertainty about my own family. I needed to know the truth, feeling that I deserved to and that it was my right. More so because I had been the one raising him from the very beginning. Finally, Susan confessed that the father was Noah. All of a sudden, my head went blank as I asked her to clarify exactly what she meant. That's when she told me about how she and Noah had gotten so close after I had introduced her to my family on Thanksgiving and stayed with us until the new year arrived. I remember Noah, always cold and aloof to me, becoming all polite and warm to her at the time. I was glad to see that Susan wanted to be taken in by my family, and I didn't want to make her feel unwelcome. She would spend a lot of time with my mom whenever she could, trying to form a bond with her. She also noticed that Noah and I weren't particularly close, and asked me about it. I finally decided to open up my complicated relationship with Noah to her, telling her how we might never make it because he could not move past his feelings. Susan understood and seemed to find empathy in my situation. Over time, she began making an effort to include Noah in our activities, probably hoping it would help us get along better. If we were going to the movies, she would invite Noah, and we would end up seeing whatever movie Noah wanted to see. In that time period, Noah and I would say a few words every now and then to each other, which, compared to years of silence, was a lot. I remember Susan and Noah would sometimes hang out and play video games, but to me it wasn't a big deal at the time. Susan told me later that Noah opened up to her about his problems and his recent breakup with his ex-girlfriend. Susan told me that Noah had seemed so vulnerable at that moment, and they became close friends. She showed me the way he would occasionally flirt with her while I was gone, and when she couldn't take it anymore, she couldn't stop any longer. As she was telling me this, a wave of nausea rose up in my throat at the mental picture of my wife and brother together. It was almost unbearable. Susan then told me how guilty she felt afterward, and how she ran away from him, deciding to leave and go back home. She said it was because she wanted to get away from what had happened, and that her decision to do so during the New Year's break was a spur-of-the-moment thing. I hadn't questioned her decision at the time. When the holidays were over and we met again at college, she looked like her usual self, and I never suspected that anything was wrong. 2 weeks later, we found out she was pregnant. Susan confessed that she had no idea if the baby was mine or Noah's, and she had no way of proving it, especially since I had already stepped up as if I were the father. I was the more reliable brother. That's why Susan decided to stay with me. This was how our marriage was based. But now I felt as if my whole world crumbled. The son whom I loved and raised for so many hours maybe wasn't even my son. Unbelievably, I asked Susan if she had been seeing Noah recently, and she slowly nodded. She told me that she and Noah were never out of touch because they had such strong chemistry between them. They would sneak off to hotels every time she told me she had to work overtime, admitted to me that most of her business trips were actually romantic getaways with him. I was reeling in my head as I asked her why she even bothered staying married to me if she wanted my brother so badly. Susan told me that she didn't want to be the one to end the marriage, and with the way I was a great father to our son, she had stayed with me all this time. She, herself, said that she had made a mistake and didn't know when it was time to stop. I took a deep breath and calmly told Susan that I appreciated her honesty, but I was going to pack up and move out. Tears began to well up in her eyes as she begged for my forgiveness, telling me that she expected me to scream and yell at her, but instead, I was silently thinking about what I was going to do now. I said nothing and just went to my cupboard and began to pack some clothes into my suitcase. Susan was still begging that I should, if I loved her, fight for our marriage, that mistakes happen in every relationship. When she figured out I wasn't biting, she changed her approach. She started talking about how our son would be affected by a divorce and how children should never grow up in a broken home. I reminded her that I might not even be the father, and that sent her into a tearful outburst. She yelled at me for being so cruel and walking away from a child she raised from birth. It was almost as if Susan thought nothing could ever make me leave our marriage. Maybe it was partly my fault, letting things slide in the past, though I really did have some love for her. It was more tied into the idea that we had a son together and had gone through so much since our college days. Susan kept saying it wasn't too late, that we still could make it work, but I just couldn't seem to believe her anymore. I had no patience left for this. The trust had been shattered, and her words did ring very hollow to my ears. Even if I forgave her, there was no forgetting she had slept with my brother. I had always believed people could make mistakes and be forgiven because we're all imperfect, but this crossed a line. I left Susan crying on the doorstep and checked into a hotel. The next day, I went straight to my parents to tell them everything about the affair between my wife and Noah and how they had been secretly seeing each other for years. The shock on their faces was undeniable. True to form, my mother first tried to defend Noah, insisting that it couldn't be true because her son would never do such a thing to his own brother. Determined to expose him, I told my parents to keep quiet and let me confront Noah in front of them. I told them to be silent so that I might unmask him. My object was that he should have supposed it to be, but it was a private conversation and I was hoping it would unmask him. When Noah answered the phone, I confronted him with everything I knew about his affair with Susan. First, he denied everything, refusal to accept the truth. But when I told him that Susan had confessed, his attitude totally changed. He started offloading the blame onto her and called her characterless, putting all the blame onto her. He said to me it wasn't his fault if women were attracted to him, as he was the better-looking brother. I replied angrily that I would expose him to all. Noah laughed at me, saying no one would believe me, and that he was the golden child anyway. I laughed at his confidence, thanking him for proving all of it. Since our parents had overheard everything, Noah fell silent, trying to find an explanation as his words stumbled, attempting to salvage his image. My mother, still in shock, demanded an explanation from Noah. He stammered through a weak attempt to justify his actions by heaping blame on everyone except himself, trying desperately to shift the blame onto Susan. I could see that my mother, who had been so very protective of her favorite son, felt a mixture of disappointment and anger. In that instant, I felt a strange kind of vindication. For years, I'd suffered at Noah's hand, but now the truth had come out and things had flipped on their head. Noah was exposed and his actions exposed for everyone to see. As Noah's words trailed off, my father, usually calm and reserved, couldn't hide his disappointment. He asked to speak with Noah directly, his voice filled with disapproval. What you've done isn't just a betrayal of your brother, it's a betrayal of this entire family. You slept with your brother's wife and continued even after they were married. Your actions have consequences, and they've permanently damaged the trust we had in you. He paused, letting his words sink in before he went on. I raised both of you to value family, loyalty, and decency. What you've shown today goes against everything I tried to teach you. You've disregarded your brother's feelings. You have trespassed on the sanctity of his marriage. It's intolerable. You've hurt him, and you've stained the very fabric that holds us together as a family." His tone hardened as he added, "I feel like your mother and I are partly to blame for what you've become, but we will no longer let you get away with this behavior. Starting today, I'm cutting you off from the college funds I set up for you. You'll have to figure out how to pay for your university fees yourself. I'm also no longer funding your lifestyle. You think it makes you more of a man to sleep with married women?" Now it was time to make Noah face the reality of what would happen without my financial support. Though I had felt like lashing out at him, I kept my cool through it all. It was the ultimate justice watching my dad hold Noah accountable. I had finally exposed his true character, and it was clear he had underestimated the consequences of his actions. My mother, however, was still not willing to give up on him and tried to justify his behavior, but my father cut him short, shutting down Noah's excuses. Then my mom walked over to me and hugged me. It had been a long time since we had shared such a moment, but in that embrace, there was silent understanding and support amidst the chaos in our family. She apologized for not having believed me earlier. To an almost unbelievable degree, in that moment, I knew that my younger self at 14 years old could never have dreamed of this day, being validated and embraced by my mother. Later, my dad helped me find a good lawyer to continue my divorce with Susan. Her lawyer really tried to play dirty, demanding alimony, because I made more money than she did. Luckily, her having an affair helped my case and made all her claims much less credible. We also did a paternity test for my son, and it proved that Noah was the father. I can't even begin to describe how painful it was to process this news. It was even worse than the first time when Susan had confessed to her infidelity. I was mad, heartbroken, and devastated by the fact that my son wasn't actually mine. But I guess there is a reason for everything, and I decided to stay strong through it all. Susan begged me to continue seeing my son, insisting that he shouldn't have to suffer for her mistakes. But I just couldn't bear to be around him. Every time I looked at him, he reminded me of Noah, and that filled me with anger. Finally, when the divorce was settled and I was free, I moved into my own place. Living on my own felt quite surreal since I had married young and, therefore, had never really lived on my own. But being the kind of person who had always relished self-sufficiency, I knew this was a chapter in my life that needed to be started. I adjusted very well to my new life as a bachelor, and I must admit, I loved it. 2 weeks ago, Dad phoned and said he was thinking about updating his will. He didn't want Noah to have anything, and when my dad made up his mind about something, there was no changing it. He was adamant that he would cut Noah out of his life and never speak to him again, and he did just that. Noah had attempted to contact both of our parents, even going as far as showing up at their door and pleading for forgiveness. But Dad wouldn't even let him in the door. My mother, who usually gave in to Noah's tantrums, seemed to have had enough, though I knew it must have been hard for her. Through it all, Noah never once reached out to me with an apology. It was clear that he wasn't sorry for what he had done. He was just upset about being shut out of the family. My dad informed me that he'd leave everything he'd worked hard for to me, and to ensure Noah didn't kick up a fuss, he'd leave him a single dollar. I was shocked when I heard this. My dad had worked hard all his life, building up his assets, retirement fund, and life insurance. The thought of all that being left to me felt surreal, but it did make sense under the circumstances. The total inheritance would be close to $3 million. The only stipulation in my dad's will was that if he died before my mom, she would still be able to live in their house, though the ownership would be signed over to me. I had no qualms about this whatsoever, as I plan to take care of my mom in her old age, irrespective of any other consideration. Somehow, someone got all this to Noah. Unable to reach his parents, he called me yesterday to try to make amends between us. He told me that he was having problems in college, and after Susan discovered his deception about the paternity of the child, she had been hounding him for child support. He told me that he didn't have any money and was seeking part-time work but could not find it. He begged me to talk to the family so we could start fresh and said he really needed my help. I couldn't help but laugh in his face. "I'm done with you," I told him. "You should have thought about all of this before you slept with my wife and got her pregnant." Noah argued that I was being unfair, saying she was to blame too. To which I agreed, but reminded him that I had already divorced her and now she was his problem, not mine. I made it clear to Noah that he had no right to complain to me about Susan or her child because, in effect, this is what his own action caused. Noah began to raise his voice, but I cut him off, informing him that he was also no longer the family's most favored child. He was now the black sheep, that one who slept with the wife of his brother. Here, I became very emotional and started crying like a baby. He said that all of them, his granddad and other relatives of ours, are against him. He was indeed taking pressure from the family people. However, this was the final straw and not my business to deal with anymore. He made it clear that we were over. He should never call me again. He was never my brother. Ever since, I have kept replaying that conversation in my head. While I hate my brother, the fact that I heard him crying is something I hadn't felt since we were kids. So, to lie, it hurt me a little seeing him so helpless. So now I'm thinking if I should talk to our parents about him or not, since it would be wrong on my part if I didn't. Update 1. Hi everyone. Many of you have been asking why I'm no longer in touch with my son Henry, and some have even called me cruel. I'm sorry, that's how it sounded. But I'm sorry, I just don't feel right raising another man's child. It isn't your average stepson situation. I was led to believe Arthur was my son, but later I found out he really was my brother's kid. I've been devastated about it and spent days grieving over it. Yet the reason I don't want to stay in contact with Arthur is that I no longer want Susan in my life. If I keep talking to her child, I know she will find a way to worm her way back into my life, and I need my space. You can call me cruel or selfish, but I just can't have him in my life right now. At least not for a very long time. Update. Many of you guessed it right. It was my mother who informed Noah about the change in my dad's will, and he called me hoping things could be set right. I confronted her in the presence of my dad, and she broke down. She said I had punished Noah enough, that he had learned his lesson. My dad, however, told her quite firmly that if she believed what Noah did was forgivable, then she was sadly mistaken. He could not continue living with her because he never forgave Noah for his betrayal. His ultimatum seemed to shut my mother up. My dad made it clear to her that if she ever contacted Noah again, and we found out, she would have to pack her bags and leave. As I said, my dad is very stubborn, and I hope my mother will learn from her mistakes. Update 3. It's been 5 months since my last update. My relationship with my parents has improved quite a lot over the past 2 months or so. My dad and I go golfing every weekend now, and he is starting to treat me more like a friend than a son. I hardly hear from my mother. She's kept her distance from Noah, and the last I heard about him is from my cousin. He told me that Noah has been asking people for money. He eventually had to drop out of college because he could no longer afford the tuition fees. He and Susan are living together now, and he has found work as a part-time mechanic. It would appear that they are raising Arthur together, which I suppose is for the best. I never bring up Noah when talking to my parents, and they never bring him up either. To everyone who's been asking, I'm doing well. I got promoted at work 2 months ago. so my salary has improved quite a lot. I haven't started dating yet. I feel like I need more time and space to heal. I go to therapy sessions, so I'll see how that goes.